Hello and welcome back to another session of Bible Basics here on YouTube. My name is John Kitchen and welcoming you to this program. I'm currently serving as the Bible Share Director for the Bible Share the Church of Christ Student Center here in Wilmington, Oklahoma. And so today we're going to continue our discussion on Christian apologetics and Christian evidence. And what we're going to address mainly today is the existence of God as proof based on the existence of a moral sphere. Now, a moral sphere is that sense of right and wrong that every person has within themselves that must logically be accounted for. And so there are two potential, when we break it down, that there are two potential sources of this moral sense. That either it came from God, that was an absolute being, or it arose elsewhere. Now, we wish to briefly dispose of the notion that the moral sense arose from natural evolutionary causes. And this is easily done based on the fact that the moral sense is an abstract mental component or composition. And the natural things such as proteins and carbohydrates and lipids and nucleic acids that give rise to individuals, don't give rise to abstract concepts. Therefore, we cannot conclude that a thing like a rock or a tree or a stone would be able to give rise to something having a moral property, because the physical things such as rocks and trees and stones and animals and whatnot, they're just not of the same order as the things in the mental or moral sphere. And so we have to account for it somewhere else. So that leaves, basically, as I've come up with and research has done, that there's four main sources. And so if you'll take a paper and make it somewhat like this, do it across, or you're doing an Excel table, you want to do on your category, you want to draw 5 vertical columns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 vertical columns, and then after you get your 5 vertical columns drawn, you can go ahead and pause the video to do this, and you need to go from left to right, and right in the top level, going across the word action, and we'll clarify these. The action, and then in the next one to the left, that might make right, and then in the next category to the left, we'll do culture, then in the next category, we'll do personal preference, or if you want something more technical, you can put moral relativism, and then in the last column to the right, you can put the moral absolute. And we'll define each of these things that we're going to talk about before we look at some examples. Now, the action column is relatively simple. What we're going to do in this table is we're going to look at, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that I have down here. 5 actions that are generally regarded as not to be tolerated, or things that are absolutely prohibited by most people that you would encounter if you went out and did a survey and asked these people questions on the street, or sent out an email survey, or if you paid for a Gallup poll, or some other formally recognized survey, that most people, if they answer something like this, that these are the things that would that would cross their mind, and So we want to use things that are readily identifiable and things that are readily classifiable and quantifiable in our analysis. Now, the next category over from action, as you have on your notes here, is might make right. And this is essentially the moral philosophical framework that says if you have enough firepower to get it done, then it's right for you and nobody can stop you. Now, there are two components to might make right. And number one, you have to have the physical power to actually accomplish the thing in and of itself. And number two, you have to be able to resist all force that would be brought to bear against you, either to prevent it from happening or as a consequence of it from happening. And so we'll illustrate this in some examples that we'll consider. The next category that we like to discuss is culture. Now, we need to make some qualifications on what we're talking about before we address culture. Now, when we consider the definition of a moral absolute, we're not talking about what is normally defined as a mores or a cultural protocol or preference. Such as in the West, like garments like what I'm wearing would be suitable, such as or in the East, people might wear long robes or wear a turban, or the question of whether women should wear veils or not. We're not talking about things like that. What we're talking about are things that are more morally absolute for all time and all people, no matter where you are in the globe, no matter what period of time you're in, that these things are either right or wrong for all people. And so that's the kind of thing that we're looking at. And so the second category is what happens if culture defines these, and what complications could arise. For example, one of the ideas in the West is that a woman should be able to marry whomever she chooses based on her own personal preference. And many in the West believe that that is an inalienable human right. Whereas there are many in the East, based on their tradition or their religious upbringing or whatnot, they believe that marriage is not such an individual choice, but marriage is something that is done by the family, and that an individual has an obligation to the family. Yet these countries from both the East and the West are signatories to Universal Human Rights Convention, and these things cause lots of trouble in the highest diplomatic circles. And so these are the kind of things that we're talking about versus the preferences to what kind of food people eat, or what kind of garments people wear, or things like that. The third category is personal preference or moral relativism. And what this basically teaches is that each individual is responsible for their own determination. And there are varying degrees of pure moral relativism or conditioned moral relativism, but we don't want to complicate the analysis in that way, but we do want to acknowledge that they exist, and the discussion of the degrees of moral relativism may be taken up at a later time. But for purposes of this analysis, we want to use pure moral relativism so as to eliminate unnecessary variables from our computation. And pure moral relativism essentially states, although somewhat simplistically, that each individual is his own moral authority and that he has the absolute right to determine what's right for him or her, and no one else has the and no one else has the ability to make that determination. Finally, moral absolutes, that the notion that there are certain things that are right across all cultures, in all times, in all places of the world. This is the final source of authority, and the only logical way to account for this source of authority is the existence of God being the supreme moral lawgiver, so that there is a powerful cause sufficient to explain the effects of the moral absolute that are binding at all times, in all places, for all people. Now, before we consider the specific examples that I've done in my, we want to consider existentially what would occur if we apply these systems to their utmost application. So on the bottom of your paper that you have here, you might draw one more line, and that way you could include that sixth category. Now, when we consider let's see, existential. Now, when we consider might make right, a problem immediately presents itself. Suppose that there's either an individual with a lot of physical strength against a smaller individual, say, a large 6'11" man that's at the height of his athletic prowess, and the other individual is a small woman that is rather slight, or a big country that has a huge war chest and a great developed military, and on its border is a small country that has little economic power, no war chest, no developed military, and has no friends to help it. Or you got two guys that are evenly matched in physical strength and ability. Might make right says that the stronger person wins, and the stronger person is able to have his way. And so we see that the stronger man would be able to prevail against the weaker woman, and the stronger nation would be able, by force of arms, to prevail against the smaller nation, and the two guys that are relatively matched would just have to fight it out. But we know that this doesn't work because even in our international law, in the dealing between nations, that this theory of might make right has been rejected as the principle of international dealing. So on an existential level, might make right must be rejected because it's too circumstantial and will get different results in different circumstances. Now the same problem applies when we deal with culture, because if one culture says something is absolutely right and the other culture says that it's absolutely wrong, then since one culture cannot force itself upon another culture, then we have a state of, basically we have what is termed in the philosophical circles an epistemological stalemate. In other words, by source of knowledge and reason, if this rule is adopted that culture is the ultimate arbiter of morality, then if one culture says yes and another culture says no, then you've got a stalemate because there's no arbiter to choose between the two. Therefore, this one gets knocked out. Now, the third is individual preference. This has the same circumstances with regard to culture because individually, if an individual says yes and the other individual says no, they're deadlocked. They can't work it out, and so they have to resort to another principle. And one of the principles in mathematics that we talk about in this kind of a context is that you have to reduce to the lowest common denominator, or in the law you have to reduce to the actual fundamental principle if the one you're working under doesn't work. And the classic illustration of this comes from Oliver Wendell Holmes' Jr. discussion of the law of torque, where he says that my right to swing my fist ends where my neighbor's nose begins. So, therefore, this system of individual preference or moral relativism fails existentially, just like culture does and might makes right. Therefore, by reason of process of elimination, which is a valid method of determining truth, that the only one that is left when we do this kind of existential analysis is the moral absolute that is given by a superior authority that exists in all times for all places. Otherwise, you're going to have arbitrary results that are based on circumstances, and this is too unpredictable for the stable world that we have to have. So that's the general theoretical analysis. So let's apply this to some examples. And I'm sure that all of the listeners that listen to this recording are familiar with the historical event of the Holocaust, in which the Third Reich exterminated 6 million Jews and Gypsies and homosexuals when Hitler was in power. And so we have to ask ourselves, as number one, would this make someone's not to be tolerated list, or things that are absolutely prohibited? And most people would say yes. Unfortunately, not all, but we are not dealing with those individuals here. But most people would say that absolutely that the Holocaust was something that never should have been done and should not be allowed under any circumstances. And while we agree with that determination, we have to ask ourselves, how do we logically come to that result? Because we can't just say, I feel this in my heart, therefore it must be true. We have to determine, how do we get there logically? And so when we look at the various frameworks, might makes right. Well, might makes right doesn't work. Here's why. Because if Hitler won, then yes, that would have been fine. But if he lost the war, as history shows that he did, then no. So the acceptability of the Holocaust actually depended upon the military strength of the Allies or the Axis powers. If we adopt the theory, might makes right. And since, as history demonstrates, that the Allies did not operate under this theory, then we know that the West has inherently rejected might makes right. Otherwise, there would not have been a logical, rational basis upon which to condemn the Holocaust. And the same is true that if Hitler had won the war, then the principle of might makes right would have indicated that he was justified in the atrocities that he and his government engaged in. So, since this is an unacceptable result for us that we must reject might make right as a valid system. The next analysis, well, culture, and that has the same defect because German culture at the time said yes and Allied culture said no. And so we had the same existential stalemate that had to be resolved by the force of arms, which was an appeal to the principle of might makes right, but was ultimately unsure because, as military historians have demonstrated to us, is that Hitler might have won if he had focused on the West, and if he had focused on the West and the Mediterranean and properly secured enough oil to keep his war machine running, rather than dividing his force and going after the East and the West together. So, and after the National Socialists took over the German parliament and gave Hitler the executive powers under the new chancellery, the German lawyers and judges were selected and put in place to allow the things that occurred, and as a matter of law that existed at the time, there was no irregularity as far as the German legal system was concerned. Therefore, the argument of culture is insufficient alone to denounce the Holocaust. Then the third question is, the third framework is moral relativism. And Hitler would say yes, and others say no. So this comes to the same problem as the previous two. But if we turn to an absolute moral standard that is given by the divine creator and supreme authority, that under this standard alone is it an absolute no. Therefore, when we look at these, that only the absolute moral standard gives us a clear no under all circumstances for all time that the Holocaust should have been condemned. And so, therefore, that is the analysis for the first example. Now let's consider the Nuremberg trials. If the Nuremberg trials had not occurred, then we wouldn't be talking about them. So if Hitler won, then there never would have been a trial to begin with, and so that inquiry would end. But if he lost, then the trial still had to convict according to the rule of law that had to be recognized by all sovereign nations and humanity, and it was not necessarily a foregone conclusion. So, therefore, we can only put maybe, and we'll talk about why here in a minute. And so, the next question is culture. And what's really interesting is when you look at the transcript of the Nuremberg trial, is the best defense that the Nazis made and that their lawyers made was that the culture of the Third Reich said that everything that was done was acceptable, and the victors that it conquered could not condemn merely on the basis of the victors over the vanquished, and that one culture had no right to set the rules for another. And so this actually brought the proceedings to a halt, and it almost ended them, but then the prosecutors shifted the ground to the absolute moral code. They called it the law behind the law. But it's ironic that at Nuremberg that culture was deemed not deficient by the prosecutors and the defense alike, and so only by changing ground, could they secure those convictions. So culture, the result is no, by agreement of both sides. And so the only one left is the moral relativism or personal preference. And obviously Hitler says yes, and opponent says no. And we've talked about the consequences of that epistemological stalemate. So we see here that under learning of the analyses, it's possible that the Nazi war criminals might have been acquitted, and only under an absolute moral system, would the Nuremberg trials have been successful. And that's why I put that yes in that final category and the no in the second one. And categories 1 and 3 are stalemate, and category 2 is no because culture says you can't do that, and category 4 says yes, the Nuremberg trial would have been successful, but only because of the absolute moral system. So if there's any ambiguity, I apologize for that. The third, let's see, what do we, the third one we have here is torture. And we want to make it simple, and so, we are exempting the question of torture of enemy combatants in extreme necessity or national security and national emergencies. We're not going to deal with the American version of the National Security Act or anything like that. We only want to talk about, for the sake of simplicity and narrowing down the variable, the example of the torture of babies and small children. Now, if might makes right is the principle, then you can do that if you can win. So and no, if you don't have the physical power to do that and be protected from a reprisal. Now, what about culture? Culture has that same result. Yes, if allowed. No, if prohibited. And the same result is individual preference. That if you want to, you can, and if you don't want to, you don't. And so only under an absolute moral code do we have the result that you can absolutely unequivocally say that the torture of babies and small children is wrong. And I don't know about you, but that is shocking to me that that only one of the four major proposed systems has the result that says under all circumstances and at all times that torturing these small innocent children would be a wrong thing to do. And so this is a striking illustration of the truth that a moral theory has real-world consequences. Next, we want to examine the advocacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King was regarded as one of the greatest civil rights activists and religious leaders of his generation that still has an impact on the world today. And so the question that we want to raise concerning the advocacy of Dr. King is under these theories, would the advocacy of Dr. King have been morally permitted, or would it have been ethically justifiable under each of these circumstances? Now, if we're examining under the theory of might makes right, then we conclude absolutely not that Dr. King's advocacy was not appropriate because he had less personal power than the culture in which he operated, and the culture in which he operated had more power to suppress him than he had to affect it in sheer terms of force. Therefore, the principle of might makes right would indicate that Dr. King did not act ethically in his advocacy for improvement. Now, what about culture? Culture has the same result because the culture in the United States at the time supported the segregation and oppression of African Americans, and so if culture was the determination of the absolute standard, then under the cultural rubric that Dr. King was operating under, he was not acting ethically by bucking that cultural system. Now, what about personal preference? The personal preference of Dr. King versus one of his opponents. He writes in his writing that he felt that he had to start advocating because of the expression of his children's faces when he had to explain to them that the new amusement park in town was called Fun Town, was open to white children only, and that African American and other races were not permitted. That's what caused him one of his reasons to begin his advocacy. So, under the moral relativist or personal preference category, Dr. King certainly thinks that he has the right to do so, but one of his opponents would say that he did not under the opponent's theory. Therefore, under the theme or under the sphere of moral relativism or personal preference, then we have another stalemate. So only if there is an absolute moral code that is given by a superior lawgiver is Dr. King justified beyond dispute to be able to make the effort of reform that he did for civil rights and civil liberties in the United States. And so think about that, the consequence of this analysis, that only one of the four systems that are philosophically determined as valid makes it clear that Dr. King did the right thing in saying that people should be treated equally without regard to race or background. That is astounding. And the final instance I want to use is an analysis of a story by, I think it's Mary Shelley, called The Lottery. And basically what happens in that story is that a small town has an annual ritual where they have a lottery, and the person who gets the piece of paper with the black dot is offered as a human sacrifice to ensure that you have good crops in the coming year. So let's analyze this scenario under these four moral frameworks. The community certainly has more power than any individual in it. So under might makes right, that's fine, we can do human sacrifice. And the same result is under culture, because if culture says that's okay and that's what you're expected to do, then that's what to do. What about personal preference? Well, It's no if you're the person that gets the piece of white paper with the black dot, and yes if you're the person that wants to maintain this system. And so only under an absolute moral system that human life is sacred can you have an absolute no result to this. And it should be noted that sources, uh, the publisher, when this was first published, received all kinds of email of outrage at the story, and several literature teachers have noted that several literature teachers have noted that when the story was put out, that literature classes were absolutely opposed to it. But now, when literature teachers ask about the story and the result, that many students, it doesn't even bother them, mainly because of culture and moral relativism. And so when we look at these at the result of our table that we've created, what have we concluded? That only under an absolute moral system do we say that the Holocaust was wrong. Only under an absolute moral system do we say that the Nuremberg trial could have been successful. Only under an absolute moral system can we say that the torture of babies and small children is absolutely wrong. Only under an absolute moral system can we say that Dr. Martin Luther King was perfectly justified in his advocacy, and only under a moral absolute system can we say that it would be wrong to use human sacrifice in a religious ritual to ensure good crops in the coming year. And so, since we've examined these items that are in most people's things, that they would actually draw a red line in the sand and say these things are not to be allowed, then the only moral framework that gives us a consistent result that we can live with under this type of analytical framework is the absolute moral system that is binding for all people at all times, that was given by a divine creator. And so we want to thank you for being with us today on this program, and we hope that it has been helpful to you and that you've taken good notes as we've gone along. And if you had any particular portion that was unclear or that you need clarification on, then you'll go back and rewatch this video again and get that clarification and get those notes taken down, because then you'll be able to share this with other people. And we want to encourage you to do this, because the current generation of millennials believes in practicality, generally speaking, above all else. And if that's the standard, then the only system that works to give the millennials the result that they can live with on these kind of questions is an absolute moral standard that is given by a divine creator. So we hope that you'll like this video and leave feedback for us in the comments, and that you'll also subscribe to the video and subscribe to the channel, and that you'll share this YouTube channel with your friends and those that you come in contact with, and share links on your social media account, so then that way we can reach other people, and that if you think that this has been of value, that you'll share it with those that are close to you. So thank you once again for joining us today, and be sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and stay tuned for another lesson in this or another one of our series coming soon.